History is often described as a record of the past. But what if history is not what was written, but what was allowed to survive? In the previous episodes, we explored the possibility that Tartaria was not a myth, but a vast civilization spanning continents, possessing monumental architecture, advanced energy systems, and a society that seemed to exist outside the linear narrative of modern history. Now, we arrive at a darker chapter. Because civilizations do not simply vanish without conflict. They are erased. This episode explores a silent war, not fought with swords and cannons alone, but with maps, textbooks, resets, and memory itself. History rarely records the exact moment a civilization ends. There is no clear timestamp for disappearance. No official document that declares, from this day forward, this world no longer exists. Instead, what history records is something far subtler. A silence. A silence where once there were names. A silence where once there were borders. A silence where once there were people, cities, and systems that interacted with the rest of the known world. Tartaria enters history not through dramatic conquest, but through this silence. For centuries, the word Tartaria appears across maps, travel accounts, diplomatic correspondence, and encyclopedias. It is not described as a myth. It is not treated as fantasy. It is treated as a geographic and political reality, vast, complex, and only partially understood by outsiders. Then, almost without warning, the references stop. Not abruptly, not violently, but gradually, as if someone slowly lowered the volume. Understanding Tartaria begins not with ruins, but with this disappearance of sound. To understand why silence matters, we must first understand how visible Tartaria once was. From the 13th through the early 18th century, European and Asian cartographers routinely labeled immense territories across Eurasia as Great Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. These were not decorative labels. They occupied entire map quadrants, stretching from Eastern Europe through Siberia, Central Asia, and into regions bordering China. For example, the Blau Atlas Meyer, 1665, depicts Tartaria as a dominant continental entity. Guillaume Delisle's maps, 1700s, carefully differentiate Tartarian regions, implying political and cultural distinctions. The Encyclopaedia Britannica, 1771, includes detailed entries discussing Tartary as a real and inhabited land. This matters because maps are conservative documents. Cartographers rarely invent entire civilizations. They rely on trade routes, diplomatic reports, explorers' accounts, state intelligence. A name appears repeatedly on maps only if it corresponds to something acknowledged by multiple powers. Tartaria was not marginal. It was central, which makes its disappearance all the more strange. When civilizations fall violently, history records it. Rome fell, and we know how. The Aztecs fell, and we know when. The Inca fell, and we know who replaced them. In each case, conquest left records, chronicles, battles, treaties, ruins layered with destruction. Tartaria leaves something different. Its cities are not widely recorded as destroyed. Its people are not described as exterminated. Its land is not shown as conquered in war. Instead, Tartaria simply stops being discussed as a unified entity. This suggests a different process. Not annihilation, but absorption. Civilizations can disappear in two primary ways: physical destruction, administrative replacement. The second is far quieter and often more permanent. Administrative replacement occurs when governance systems are dissolved, borders are redefined, identities are reclassified. History is reorganized under new frameworks. This process does not require armies burning cities. It requires institutions rewriting definitions. Tartaria's silence aligns with this second model. As its name fades, new political entities expand. The Russian Empire, Qing China, centralized European states. The land remains. The people remain. But the organizing identity changes. Tartaria becomes a region, a footnote, eventually a historical curiosity. If Tartaria had been violently erased, it would provoke questions. Violence leaves scars. Scars invite investigation. Silence, however, invites assumption. When something is not mentioned, later generations assume it was never important or never real. This is how history compresses. Entire civilizations can be reduced to tribes, nomads, undefined peoples, not because that description is accurate, but because it is convenient. Silence simplifies complexity. Despite the growing silence, early travelers left traces that did not fully disappear. Accounts from merchants, missionaries, and diplomats describe Tartarian lands as highly organized, agriculturally productive, culturally distinct, governed by structured systems. Some reports mention wide stone roads, grand public buildings, cities laid out on geometric plans. These descriptions clash with later portrayals of Tartaria as sparsely populated wilderness. This contradiction matters, because when historical descriptions change dramatically, without new evidence, it often signals a narrative shift, not a discovery. One of the most unsettling aspects of Tartarian silence is scale. Tartaria was not small. It was continental. To remove a civilization of that scale from mainstream historical consciousness would require consistent agreement among emerging powers, standardized education systems, unified cartographic updates, long-term narrative discipline. This suggests coordination, not necessarily conspiracy, but alignment. Empires align narratives the same way they align borders. Why would emerging powers prefer silence? Because inherited complexity destabilizes authority. If Tartaria represented advanced systems predating modern states, alternative models of governance, large-scale organization outside European frameworks, then acknowledging it would challenge the story of linear progress. Modern authority relies on a simple timeline: ancient, primitive; medieval, transitional; modern, advanced. Tartaria disrupts this progression, and disruptions are rarely welcomed by centralized power. Even when names vanish, structures remain. Across former Tartarian regions, we find monumental architecture without clear origin, cities with infrastructure seemingly ahead of their recorded founding dates, engineering feats attributed to rapid construction by newly formed states. In many cases, official explanations emphasize extraordinary labor, remarkable ambition, coincidence. But coincidence, repeated across continents, begins to resemble inheritance. These structures feel older than their labels, and old things ask uncomfortable questions. Silence is not absence. It is presence without acknowledgement. The silence around Tartaria is filled with renamed cities, reclassified peoples, reinterpreted buildings, simplified timelines. Nothing disappears. It is reorganized, and reorganization always serves someone. This first silence is the foundation. Before myths are dismissed, before giants are ridiculed, before education is standardized, there must first be quiet. Because once something stops being spoken of, it becomes vulnerable. Vulnerable to reinterpretation. Vulnerable to ownership. Vulnerable to forgetting. Tartaria did not vanish overnight. It faded, carefully. If Tartaria was not destroyed, and if it was not imaginary, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What mechanisms allowed such a vast identity to be quietly replaced? In the next part, we will examine maps themselves, not as neutral tools, but as instruments of authority. Because before history is written in books, it is drawn on paper, and once a border moves, memory often follows. Maps are often treated as neutral objects, technical drawings meant to guide travelers and define borders. But historically, maps have never been neutral. They are statements of authority. To draw a map is to decide what exists, what is named, what is important, what is ignored. Every line on a map represents a decision. Every label represents recognition. Before Tartaria fades from historical discussion, something else happens first. Its representation on maps begins to shift. Not suddenly, not violently, but progressively, edition by edition. For several centuries, Tartaria appears on maps with remarkable consistency. Different cartographers from different countries, working decades apart, independently label vast regions as Tartaria. This consistency matters because it suggests shared recognition rather than imagination. Consider the 17th century European map tradition. The Dutch cartographic school, among the most respected in the world, repeatedly includes Great Tartary as a defined region. French cartographers distinguish between independent Tartary and neighboring imperial territories. British atlases include Tartary as a geopolitical space worthy of explanation. These were not fantasy maps. They were tools of trade, diplomacy, and navigation. Merchants relied on them. Statesmen referenced them. Explorers carried them. To include Tartaria was to acknowledge its existence as a meaningful entity. Then, over the course of the 18th and early 19th centuries, something changes. Later editions of maps do not announce the disappearance of Tartaria. There is no bold line crossing it out. Instead, borders are redrawn. Labels are fragmented. The name Tartaria is gradually replaced by administrative subdivisions. A map from one decade may still show Great Tartary. A later edition shows only regional names. A generation later, the term disappears entirely. This is not erasure by force. It is erasure by revision. Deleting a name invites questions. Revising it invites acceptance. When a name slowly disappears through updates, later readers assume the new version is more accurate. The old version was mistaken. Progress has corrected error. Maps carry an implicit authority. Newer equals better. This assumption allows historical memory to be overwritten without resistance. The interior of Eurasia provides a clear example. Early maps show Tartaria occupying a massive, continuous zone across what is now Siberia, Central Asia, parts of Eastern Europe. Later maps fragment this area into provinces, colonies, imperial territories. What disappears is not land, but cohesion. Instead of one named entity, the region becomes a mosaic of administrative units. Fragmentation replaces identity. Normally, borders change because of war. Wars leave records, treaties, battles, casualties, political upheaval. But the borders replacing Tartaria do not correspond to a single defining conflict. There is no widely recorded war titled The Fall of Tartaria. This absence is striking. It suggests that the map changes reflect administrative absorption, not conquest. Empires expanded. Regions were reorganized. Existing systems were incorporated. Maps simply followed suit. The timing of Tartaria's cartographic disappearance coincides with another major shift: the rise of standardized printing and centralized publishing. Earlier maps were often handcrafted, regionally influenced, and diverse. Later maps were mass-produced, state-approved, standardized across education systems. Once a new map style becomes dominant, Alternative versions fade. What is printed repeatedly becomes truth by repetition. As maps change, reference books follow. Early encyclopedias discuss Tartaria as a real place with history and people. Later editions reduce the entry. Eventually, Tartaria becomes a historical term, an outdated label, a vague reference to nomadic groups. This shift mirrors the maps. When spatial recognition disappears, conceptual recognition follows. Notice the language used in later references. Instead of civilization, region, polity, we see terms like frontier, wilderness, sparsely populated lands. Language reshapes perception. A civilization commands respect. A frontier invites control. By changing labels, maps redefine legitimacy. Defenders of modern cartography often argue that early maps were inaccurate, that Tartaria was a misunderstood placeholder. This explanation sounds reasonable, but it raises a critical question. How could so many independent cartographers across centuries and cultures consistently misunderstand an entire continent? Cartographers were not isolated dreamers. They relied on trade intelligence, diplomatic reports, military reconnaissance. Mistakes happen, but consistency suggests shared information, not shared error. A closer look suggests that Tartaria was not corrected, it was replaced. Instead of saying Tartaria was wrong, newer maps simply stop mentioning it. This is a crucial distinction. Correction involves explanation. Replacement involves silence. Naming is governance. When a place is named, it is recognized. When it is renamed, it is reclassified. When its name disappears, it loses autonomy in memory. Colonial history provides many examples of this process. Tartaria's cartographic evolution follows the same pattern, but on a continental scale. Why didn't people protest the disappearance of Tartaria from maps? Because most people do not question maps. Maps are presented as factual. They are taught in schools. They are used by authorities. Once a map changes, reality appears to change with it. Space shapes identity. When a large, named region disappears, its people are reclassified. Their history becomes local instead of civilizational. Their legacy becomes fragmented. Over time, descendants no longer identify with the old name. Memory dissolves naturally. Maps represent the first visible layer of historical control. Before textbooks, before myths, before ridicule. If Tartaria disappears from maps, it becomes vulnerable everywhere else. Once geography is rewritten, history follows. If Tartaria was merely a cartographic mistake, its correction would be clearly documented. But what we see instead is gradual removal, silent replacement, consistent fragmentation. This pattern raises a deeper question. Were maps recording discovery or enforcing a new order? Maps do not exist in isolation. They reflect political power, administrative reach, and centralized authority. As Tartaria fades from maps, a new type of power rises, one that governs through uniform systems rather than diverse regions. In the next part, we examine how centralized authority expanded alongside these cartographic changes, and why simplifying the past became essential to maintaining control. Because once a land is redrawn, the people living on it are next. Power rarely announces itself with noise. More often, it arrives quietly, through paperwork, administration, standardization, and routine. By the time people realize authority has shifted, the shift has already been normalized. As Tartaria fades from maps, another transformation unfolds across Eurasia. The steady rise of centralized authority. This rise does not look like invasion. It looks like organization. Earlier civilizations often operated as networks rather than monoliths. Regions maintained local governance, cultural autonomy, inherited systems adapted to geography and tradition. Tartaria, as depicted in earlier records, appears to follow this model, a broad civilizational space with internal diversity rather than a single rigid state. Centralized authority replaces this diversity with uniformity. One law, one administration, one official narrative. This shift simplifies governance and memory. Centralization becomes easier once a large identity disappears. Without Tartaria as a recognized entity, land becomes administratively available. Populations become reclassifiable. Governance can be reorganized without resistance to civilizational loss. This is not conquest in the traditional sense. It is absorption by redefinition. Across regions formerly associated with Tartaria, historical records show a surge of census-taking, taxation systems, standardized law codes, appointed governors replacing local authorities. These changes are often framed as modernization. But modernization always has a direction. It flows from center to periphery. One recurring pattern appears in newly centralized states: the rapid emergence of grand capitals. Cities described as newly founded often sit atop older infrastructure, massive stone foundations, advanced layouts difficult to explain within short construction timelines. Official narratives emphasize ambition and progress. But ambition alone does not explain scale. The question remains: were these cities built or inherited? Centralized power often repurposes what already exists. Law does more than regulate behavior. It defines legitimacy. As centralized authority expands, legal systems begin to invalidate previous governance structures, declare new standards of land ownership, redefine citizenship. Older systems are not debated. They are rendered obsolete by decree. Once a system is legally invalid, its memory loses authority. Centralization requires a common language. Across Eurasia, emerging powers enforce official languages, standardized education, centralized curricula. Local dialects persist, but they lose institutional backing. With language control comes narrative control. History written in one language becomes dominant. Other versions fade into oral tradition, and then silence. Contrary to popular belief, centralized power does not always fight spiritual systems. Often, it aligns with them. Institutional religions provide moral legitimacy, hierarchical structure, obedience frameworks. Where earlier spiritual systems may have been localized or decentralized, centralized authority favors standardized belief structures. Diversity becomes inefficiency. Between local communities and centralized states once existed intermediate authorities, regional councils, hereditary administrators, cultural elites. These intermediaries preserve memory. Centralization eliminates them. Not violently, but administratively. Their roles are absorbed. Their records are archived. Their relevance disappears. Centralized authority reveals itself through infrastructure. Roads are standardized. Measurements are unified. Timekeeping is synchronized. These changes appear technical, even beneficial. But infrastructure determines movement, trade, and communication. Control infrastructure, and you control interaction. Historical timelines show numerous institutions appearing fully formed within decades. Academies, ministries, bureaucracies. Such rapid development suggests inheritance. Institutions rarely emerge from nothing. They are adapted from existing frameworks. If Tartaria possessed advanced organizational systems, centralization may have absorbed them quietly. Centralized power thrives on simplicity. A complex past invites comparison. Comparison invites questioning. By shortening history, authority appears inevitable. If civilization seems recent, current power structures feel natural, even necessary. But if civilizations rose and fell before, permanence becomes illusion. Centralized authority does not need to destroy the past. It only needs to redefine it, reorganize it, teach it differently. Over time, the population internalizes the new structure. Resistance fades, not because people agree, but because alternatives disappear from memory. One of the most telling signs of centralized historical replacement is the lack of debate. No widespread controversy records the loss of Tartaria. Why? Because debate requires competing authorities. Once authority centralizes, disagreement becomes marginal. What remains is consensus or silence. Centralized narratives drain emotion from earlier civilizations. Tartaria becomes vague, distant, irrelevant. Emotion attaches to the present. Loyalty follows relevance. Without emotional investment, historical curiosity fades. Centralized power does not write history from scratch. It edits. It trims complexity. It rearranges emphasis. It decides what deserves attention. In this process, Tartaria does not need to be denied. It only needs to be minimized. By the time centralization is complete, it feels natural. People grow up within its systems. They cannot imagine alternatives. Authority no longer needs to assert itself. It is assumed. This is the most stable form of power. What was once a civilizational identity becomes provinces, ethnic groups, geographic terms. Unity dissolves. Without unity, memory fragments. And fragmented memory cannot challenge centralized narratives. Once authority centralizes, a final step remains. The past must be rebranded, buildings reassigned, dates adjusted, origins simplified. This is not falsification. It is reinterpretation. And reinterpretation is far more durable. Centralized authority establishes control over land, law, language, institutions. But it does not stop there. To fully stabilize power, the past itself must be made compatible with the present. In the next part, we will examine how architecture, monuments, and inherited structures were rebranded, not destroyed, transforming Tartaria's physical legacy into assets of newer powers. Because when stone survives longer than memory, ownership becomes a matter of narrative. When a civilization fades from written memory, its buildings often remain. Stone outlives paper. Architecture endures long after language changes. This creates a problem for centralized authority. If Tartaria's identity disappeared quietly, its physical legacy could not simply vanish. Cities, roads, public halls, and monumental structures still stood, silent witnesses to an unnamed past. The solution was not destruction. It was rebranding. Rebranding the past does not mean fabricating structures. It means changing who built them, when they were built, why they exist. A building can remain physically untouched while its meaning is completely transformed. Ownership of the past is not determined by stone. It is determined by story. Across regions formerly associated with Tartaria, a recurring pattern appears. Buildings officially dated to relatively recent centuries exhibit massive scale, precise symmetry, advanced engineering, materials difficult to source quickly. The official explanation is often ambition. But ambition does not replace time. Complex infrastructure typically requires generations of planning, established supply chains, accumulated expertise. When such structures appear suddenly in historical timelines, they raise quiet questions. One of the simplest forms of rebranding is renaming. Cities change names. Regions are reassigned. Structures are retitled. Once a name changes, continuity is broken. Later generations assume the new name marks a new beginning, even if the physical structure predates it. This process does not feel deceptive. It feels administrative. Many cities across Eurasia are officially described as founded in specific years. Yet their earliest records often show established street grids, large civic buildings, defensive structures already in place. Founding, in these cases, may mean rechartering, renaming, incorporation into a new state, not initial construction. Centralized powers often inherit infrastructure. Building from nothing is costly. Repurposing is efficient. Existing structures can be restored, repurposed, reattributed. This allows new regimes to project strength instantly. The past becomes a resource. Archaeology is often portrayed as objective, but archaeology operates within frameworks, funding priorities, approved narratives, institutional expectations. Excavations tend to answer permitted questions. If a structure fits the accepted timeline, it is celebrated. If it does not, it is reinterpreted, redated, classified as anomalous. Anomalies are rarely pursued aggressively. They complicate coherence. Restoration can be a subtle form of alteration. When buildings are restored, original features may be removed. Later additions may be emphasized. Inscriptions may be replaced or omitted. The structure remains, but its story shifts. Visitors see what the narrative allows them to see. Official explanations often focus on surface elements, ornamentation, facade style, decorative motifs. But structural engineering tells a deeper story. Foundations, load-bearing systems, and urban planning often reveal greater age, inherited knowledge, continuity across supposed historical breaks. These deeper layers are harder to rebrand, but easier to ignore. Why not simply demolish older structures? Because destruction invites investigation. Ruins provoke curiosity. Absence raises questions. Rebranding avoids this. A functioning building draws admiration, not suspicion. People rarely ask who built something they are told is familiar. Museums play a crucial role in rebranding. Artifacts are categorized, labeled, contextualized. Context determines meaning. An object presented as imperial reinforces authority. The same object presented as unknown origin destabilizes it. Curatorial choices shape perception. Dating methods often involve interpretation. Materials, style, and context are cross-referenced. Small assumptions compound. Once a date is established, it becomes reference for other dates. A timeline stabilizes, even if its foundation is interpretive. Rebranding does not require false dates, only convenient ones. If the builders of a structure are unnamed, credit flows to whoever governs the land. This is not malicious. It is procedural. History credits the visible authority. Silence about predecessors makes room for inheritance. Physical continuity does not guarantee historical continuity. A city can function for centuries under different identities. Without narrative continuity, people perceive each phase as separate, even if the transition was seamless. This illusion of discontinuity protects the present from the past. Rebranding makes history comfortable. It aligns monuments with known empires. It simplifies complexity. It avoids unsettling questions. People prefer certainty to ambiguity. Rebranding provides certainty. If Tartaria existed as a complex civilization, its physical remnants would be extensive. Rebranding allows those remnants to remain visible without challenging dominant narratives. The past is preserved, but neutralized. Perhaps the most telling aspect of rebranding is this. Buildings survive. Names survive. Dates survive. But builders disappear. A civilization without builders becomes an abstraction, and abstractions are safe. Once rebranded, former Tartarian structures become heritage sites, tourist attractions, symbols of national pride. Their deeper origins become irrelevant. Function replaces meaning. Rebranding frames history as complete. Questions are unnecessary. Debate is discouraged. Curiosity is redirected. The past becomes something to admire, not explore. Once the past is rebranded, alternative interpretations become unnecessary and eventually absurd. Anyone questioning official origins appears disruptive. Ridicule becomes the final defense. With architecture rebranded and ownership reassigned, only one unresolved element remains: stories, legends, myths, giants. In the next part, we will examine how certain figures, particularly giants, were transformed from possible historical beings into narrative problems. Because some stories are not erased, they are made unbelievable. The problem of giants is not whether they existed. The problem is whether history can accommodate them. Giants do not simply challenge biology. They challenge scale, chronology, and authorship. If giants were real, even as a rare or transitional human variation, then many assumptions about the ancient world would need reconsideration. And reconsideration destabilizes certainty. For centralized narratives, certainty is essential. One of the most difficult aspects of the giant's narrative is its universality. Stories of giant beings appear in Eurasian legends, indigenous American traditions, Middle Eastern texts, Northern European sagas, Asian folklore. These stories are geographically isolated yet structurally similar. Giants are consistently described as builders, predecessors, ancient, often wiser or more powerful than later humans. When a motif appears globally, historians face a dilemma: coincidence, shared mythological archetype, or fragmented memory of something real. The third option is the most disruptive. In many traditions, giants are not merely monsters. They are builders. Legends often credit giants with erecting massive stone structures, shaping landscapes, constructing cities before humans. This is significant because architecture, unlike stories, is measurable. When ancient structures exhibit scale that seems disproportionate to recorded populations or technology, giants become a narrative inconvenience. They offer an explanation that does not fit the accepted timeline. Across regions associated with Tartaria, we encounter oversized doorways, massive staircases, monumental stone blocks, halls designed for unusually tall proportions. Official explanations often suggest symbolic grandeur, aesthetic exaggeration, ceremonial scale. These explanations are plausible. But when oversized design becomes systematic rather than exceptional, it invites further inquiry. Giants offer a simple explanation, which is precisely why they are resisted. Simple explanations that disrupt accepted history are dangerous. In many ancient accounts, giants are not depicted as foreign invaders. They are ancestors. They lived before, not outside. This distinction matters. If giants are ancestors, then modern humans are not the first advanced civilization. Human history is layered, not linear. Decline is possible, not just progress. Such ideas undermine narratives of inevitable advancement. Over time, giants undergo narrative transformation. Early texts describe them ambiguously, sometimes factual, sometimes symbolic. Later retellings exaggerate them. Eventually, they become monsters, villains, cautionary tales. This transformation neutralizes their historical implications. Once giants are monstrous, they are no longer relevant. Ridicule is a powerful historical tool. Ideas that cannot be disproven are often mocked instead. Giants become fairy tales, children's stories, absurd fantasies. Once ridicule attaches, serious discussion becomes socially costly. This is not censorship. It is conditioning. Large-scale ancient construction poses a logistical problem. If populations were small and tools limited, how were massive projects completed? Conventional explanations rely on extraordinary manpower, long timelines, remarkable coordination. These explanations are not impossible. But giants introduce an alternative variable: labor with greater strength and reach. This alternative is rarely explored, not because it is impossible, but because it complicates established models. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, reports occasionally surface describing unusually large skeletal remains. These reports are inconsistent, often poorly documented, sometimes sensationalized. They are not conclusive evidence, but their disappearance from mainstream discussion is notable. Ambiguous evidence is not investigated. It is ignored. Ambiguity destabilizes certainty. Even when physical evidence fades, language preserves traces. Place names, expressions, and metaphors referencing giants persist. Words associated with strength, height, ancient builders. These linguistic remnants suggest long-standing cultural memory. Language remembers what writing forgets. Within the Tartarian narrative, giants present a specific challenge. If Tartaria inherited or coexisted with giant beings, its architectural scale becomes less mysterious. Its rapid development becomes more plausible. Its decline becomes more complex. Giants would not be mythic outsiders. They would be participants. This complicates any simplified history. Centralized history requires consistency. Giants introduce variability. They force questions. Who built this? Who lived here before? Why are modern humans smaller? These questions have no easy answers. So giants are fictionalized. Once fictional, they no longer threaten coherence. As education systems standardized, giants disappeared from curricula. They survived only as myth, legends, folklore, separated from archaeology, separated from history. This compartmentalization prevents cross-questioning. Myth does not challenge fact by design. Perhaps the most unsettling implication of giants is not their size, but what they represent. They represent a world before collapse, a humanity different from ours, the possibility of regression. Progress narratives depend on the idea that the future is always greater. Giants suggest the opposite may have occurred before. Over time, giants move from narrative problem to punchline. Cartoons, movies, fantasy novels. This cultural saturation ensures they are never taken seriously again. The problem is solved. When giants are removed from serious discussion, architecture becomes mysterious. Timelines stretch awkwardly. Explanations multiply. The past becomes complex, but manageable. Manageable complexity is preferable to disruptive simplicity. The absence of giants from modern historical frameworks is not proof they did not exist. It is proof that they are incompatible with the current story. Compatibility determines inclusion. Giants are not erased. They are contained. Contained within fiction. Contained within myth. Contained within entertainment. Once contained, they lose explanatory power. With giants neutralized and architecture rebranded, history appears stable. But stability requires reinforcement. The final mechanism is not narrative or ridicule. It is education. In the final part, we will examine how standardized education systems became the ultimate lock, ensuring that Tartaria, giants, and alternative interpretations remain outside acceptable discourse. Because once a story is not taught, it no longer needs to be defended. The most stable form of power is the one that no longer needs to defend itself. It does not debate. It does not persuade. It does not explain. It teaches. Once an idea is embedded in education, it becomes invisible, not because it is hidden, but because it is assumed. This is the final lock. Education is often presented as a neutral transfer of knowledge. In reality, it functions as infrastructure. Just like roads determine movement, education determines thought. What questions are legitimate? Which answers are acceptable? Where curiosity should stop. What is excluded from education is not debated. It is simply unknown. The disappearance of Tartaria from mainstream awareness coincides with a major historical shift: the rise of standardized, state-controlled education. Before this period, knowledge was decentralized. Learning varied by region. Local histories persisted. After standardization, curricula became uniform. Timelines became fixed. Alternative narratives disappeared. This shift was not malicious. It was efficient. Efficiency favors simplicity. Textbooks do not record history. They compress it. Complexity is reduced. Ambiguity is removed. Contradictions are resolved in favor of coherence. This is necessary for teaching. But coherence comes at a cost. Civilizations that do not fit the compressed timeline are minimized or omitted. Tartaria does not disappear because it is disproven. It disappears because it is inconvenient. Early historical inquiry was exploratory. Later education emphasizes answers. Students are taught what happened, when it happened, who was involved. Rarely are they taught what remains unexplained, where evidence is incomplete, which assumptions underlie conclusions. Curiosity is redirected toward mastery, not investigation. Education confers legitimacy through certification. Degrees define who is allowed to speak. Institutions define what counts as knowledge. Ideas outside the system are dismissed not because they are false, but because they are unofficial. This creates a self-reinforcing loop. Institutions validate approved narratives. Approved narratives justify institutions. Alternative histories have no entry point. To teach efficiently, history is fragmented. Ancient history, medieval history, modern history. These categories appear natural. They are not. They create artificial breaks that prevent continuity. Tartaria falls into these gaps. Too recent to be ancient. Too advanced to be medieval. Too inconvenient to be modern. So it disappears between chapters. Uncertainty is uncomfortable in classrooms. Teachers prefer clarity. Students prefer certainty. Institutions prefer control. As a result, ambiguous evidence is avoided. Unresolved questions are excluded. Speculative discussion is discouraged. Education prioritizes what can be tested. What cannot be tested is forgotten. Giants survive only as folklore. They are placed deliberately outside history. This separation is critical. By categorizing giants as myth, education ensures they are never analyzed archaeologically. They are never linked to architecture. They are never discussed as historical possibilities. Containment is complete. Modern education creates the impression that everything important is already known. This illusion discourages exploration. If Tartaria mattered, students assume they would have learned about it. Silence becomes proof of absence. Scholars operate within incentives. Research funding, publication, and career advancement favor alignment with accepted frameworks. Questioning foundational timelines carries risk. As a result, many inquiries are never pursued, not because they are forbidden, but because they are unprofitable. Examinations reward repetition, not curiosity. Students learn what will be tested. If Tartaria is not on the exam, it does not exist. This mechanism ensures long-term narrative stability. Generations pass without exposure to alternative interpretations. Over time, education replaces cultural memory. Oral traditions fade. Local histories dissolve. Personal curiosity is redirected. What remains is standardized memory. This memory feels objective. It feels complete. But completeness is an illusion created by exclusion. The greatest success of standardized education is that it appears benevolent. It expands literacy. It spreads knowledge. It empowers societies. And it does. But empowerment always occurs within boundaries. Education does not eliminate curiosity. It channels it. People do not miss what they never knew. Without exposure, there is no loss, no outrage, no demand for explanation. This is the quietest form of historical control. By the time maps are revised, authority is centralized, architecture is rebranded, giants are fictionalized, education is standardized, the system no longer requires enforcement. The lock is internal. People defend the narrative themselves. Despite this, not everything is sealed. Curiosity persists. Anomalies remain. Questions resurface. The Internet, decentralized research, and renewed interest in forgotten histories reopen cracks, not to replace one certainty with another, but to restore inquiry. This series does not claim definitive answers. It highlights absences. Absence is not evidence, but it is an invitation to ask, what was simplified? What was excluded? What remains unexplored? Education taught us what to know, but learning does not end with education. The responsibility now shifts to the individual, to question gently, to investigate carefully, to separate curiosity from belief. Tartaria does not need to be proven. It needs to be reconsidered, because civilizations do not vanish without trace. They vanish when memory is reorganized. In the next episode, we will step away from power and narratives and explore energy systems attributed to Tartaria, not as proof, but as possibility. Because imagination is the first thing centralized history tries to limit.